If there is any book in the New Testament that Hebrew Israelites hate to talk about, it's the book of Galatians. And as a matter of fact, you'll find that many Hebrew Israelites avoid the Pauline epistles altogether because their whole system falls apart in light of his writings. Oftentimes, they will incorrectly quote 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 15 and 16 as some type of justification for why Paul's writings aren't authoritative. And ironically, they do exactly what Peter is warning against and wrest or twist the scriptures to their own destruction. What's going on, YouTube? My name is Brother Dalaino. If you enjoyed this content, please hit that like and subscribe button. So what is the book of Galatians about? Paul is writing to churches in Galatia, which is a region in Minor Asia, which is modern day Turkey. And he already preached to these churches the gospel and they believed it. But something happened afterwards. You had some false teachers come into these churches and begin to teach doctrines that are contrary to what Paul had already taught them. They began to preach a false gospel. And the main gist of this false gospel was that the Gentiles had to keep the law of Moses in order to be saved. The name given to these people preaching this false gospel is commonly known as the Judaizers. They were called this because they sought to bring Gentile converts under the Levitical laws of the Old Testament. And the name derives from the last part of Galatians chapter 2, verse 14, where Paul confronts Peter and says, I got it here. Let's read it. It says, but when I saw that they walk not uprightly according to the truth of the gospel, I said unto Peter before them all, if thou being a Jew livest after the manner of Gentiles and not as do the Jews, why compellest thou the Gentiles to live as do the Jews? The Greek word for the last time Jews is used in that verse is Iudaizo. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but that Greek word literally means to live as Jews. And it's the only time that it's used in the entire New Testament. And this is where we get the term Judaizer from. It is one who compels the Gentiles to live as the Jews. And you will see Paul referring to the Hebrew Israelites the Judaizers constantly throughout his epistle. If you look at Galatians chapter 1, verses 6 through 9, look at what he says. He says, I marvel that ye are so soon removed from him that called you into the grace of Christ and to another gospel, which is not another. And he says, but there be some that trouble you. There be some that trouble you and would pervert the gospel of Christ. But though we or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel unto you than that which we have preached unto you, let him be accursed. As we said before, so say I now again, if any man preach any other gospel unto you than that ye have received, let him be accursed. The people that are troubling the Galatian Christians, those are the Judaizers. Paul refers to them again in Galatians chapter 2, verse 14 as false brethren, unawares brought in, who came in privily to spy out our liberty which we have in Christ Jesus, that they might bring us into bondage. Once again, in Galatians chapter 3, verse 1, Paul refers to the Judaizers while reprimanding the Galatian Christians when he says, O foolish Galatians, who hath bewitched you that ye should not obey the truth, before whose eyes Jesus Christ has been evidently set forth, crucified among you? Who hath bewitched you? It's the Judaizers. Paul says in Galatians chapter 4, verse 17, he says, they zealously affect you, but not well. Yea, they would exclude you that ye might affect them. The they is the Judaizers. The Judaizers had great zeal, but it was in the wrong thing, just as Paul had great zeal before his conversion, but it was in the wrong thing. You see, Hebrew Israelites have great zeal, but it is sadly misguided. Let's continue on. Galatians chapter 5, verses 7 through 8. Paul says, ye did run well. Who did hinder you that ye should not obey the truth? This persuasion cometh not of him that calleth you. Galatians chapter 5, verse 10, it says, I have confidence in you through the Lord, that ye will be none otherwise minded. But he that troubleth you, the Judaizers, shall bear his judgment, whosoever he be. Then he goes on to say in Galatians 5:12, I would they, the Judaizers, were even cut off, which trouble you. And then lastly, Paul says in Galatians chapter 6, verse 12 through 13, as many as desire to make a fair show in the flesh, they, the Judaizers, constrain you to be circumcised, only lest they should suffer persecution for the cross of Christ. For neither they themselves, the Judaizers, who were circumcised, keep the law, but desire to have you circumcised, that they may glory in your flesh. Isn't that ironic? They want for you to keep the law, but they themselves, they can't keep the law because it's impossible to keep the law perfectly. It is impossible to keep the law. The Bible actually says in James chapter 2 that if you break the law in one point, you're guilty of breaking it all. So it's impossible. That means that if you break one of God's commandments, you're guilty of breaking all of them. So the Hebrew Israelites, they go around telling people that they must keep the commandments, and it's impossible for them to do. It was impossible for the Israelites in the Old Testament to do. They failed. They did not hold their end of the bargain, their end of the covenant that was made to them on Mount Sinai. They failed miserably, the Israelites did. And if you try and you attempt to keep the law, you will fail miserably. There was only one person who has ever walked this earth that kept the law perfectly and fulfilled it, and that person is Jesus Christ. That person is Jesus Christ. You see, Paul was very stern when dealing with these false teachers and their false doctrine. He actually, as we said at the beginning, he publicly rebuked the apostle Peter for falling victim to these insidious teachings and mindset of the Judaizers, which brings us back to where we first started. Paul said unto Peter before them all, if thou, being a Jew, livest after the manner of Gentiles, and not as do the Jews, why compellest thou the Gentiles to live as do the Jews? Paul said when he saw that they walked not uprightly according to the truth of the gospel. He said that when he saw them not walking according to the truth of the gospel. What is the truth of the gospel? I'm glad you asked. It's 2 verses down in verse 16 of the same chapter. Galatians chapter 2, verse 16 says, knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but by the faith of Jesus Christ. Even we have believed in Jesus Christ that we might be justified by the faith of Christ and not by the works of the law. Listen, please listen to this, Hebrew Israelite. Please listen to this, man or woman who believes that you can be justified by the law. Listen to what Paul says in Galatians chapter 2, verse 16. Listen, he says, for by the works of the law shall no flesh be justified. That's the truth of the gospel. The law does not save you. It is only faith in Jesus Christ that saves. For by grace are ye saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. I'm Brother Dalaino. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Until next time, see ya.